Today's topic has to do with Elizabeth and her court. A few years ago, I got into an interesting conversation with somebody regarding eschatology, or the Christian doctrine of end times. I proposed that if in fact the millennium kingdom is a literal 1,000-year period in which Christ reigns on this earth with his believers, and if I'm going to be a part of that, then I want to start making some preparations. And so I let this person know that I put in my request before the divine throne to become the official photographer of the Millennium Kingdom. That person thought I was absolutely crazy. You can't make a request to God like that. He's got his own agenda, and how dare you, make that type of petition before him. Anyway, that probably isn't going to work to be the Millennial Kingdom photographer 500 years from now. But what about 500 years ago? If I'm crazy enough to do that, I'm crazy enough to imagine what it could have been like to be the official photographer for the Elizabethan Court. Today I put together a proposal for a local organization here in North Texas to do photography and videography for them for really throughout much of 2019 to document the significant events that take place in the life of that organization. And I couldn't help but think, after I got done with that proposal and turned my attention towards Will Durant's series here on the Ecstasy of England, which is book one of The Age of Reason Begins, couldn't help but think what fun that would have been to have been that official photographer. Now, of course, I say photographer. I know the camera wasn't invented back then, so I will use suspended belief and just imagine that I could still have all of the gear that comes out today, all of the technology, including computers, the ability to edit my photos in Lightroom and Photoshop and all that stuff. Because it doesn't take long before it's like, well, how are you going to recharge your batteries and all that stuff. We'll just assume that all that stuff works out. So if it did, what would my photography endeavor look like during the Elizabethan reign? Basically to be to Queen Elizabeth what Pete Sousa was to President Obama here in the United States and presidents that even preceded him. The first thing I would do is I would take an amazing number of portraits of Queen Elizabeth, and I think she would be totally on board with this because she loved fashion. She had over 2,000 dresses in her wardrobe with all the accessories that went with that. She also primarily spent time in 5 palaces there in England. There was Whitehall. I'll just put pictures of these up quickly. There was Windsor. There was Greenwich and Richmond, and of course, Hampton Court. All of these would make spectacular backdrops for portraits. And I would also love to have my own lighting team of people to hold my off-camera flashes with all the modifiers that I would need, and could really have some fun training these people and having an army of gorgeous light that I could use for the photos. So those are some locations, but what happens in those locations? There, of course, are the formal proceedings of the royal court, but then there was an Office of Revelry, which, to my way of thinking, is almost like the cruise director of the Elizabethan Court, the person who puts on the royal entertainment. And that position developed along the lines of censoring plays and all that stuff a little bit later. But at least early in her reign, it was more about what entertainment are we going to put on the stage in terms of actors, musicians, etc. A lot of those activities took place within the context of these amazing holidays. And not coming from a liturgical background, I tend to think of Christmas and Easter, and that's kind of what it is. But when I read through the section here in Durant's chapter, there were a number of other special days, such as Ascension Day, which is not really on my radar. But after doing some reading about it, it was common, apparently, for some of the churches on this day to do what they called beating the bounds. And I'll link to a video in the comment section below here on YouTube. That is when people from the church would go out with sticks and would beat on the stones that marked the perimeters for that particular parish. Now, part of the tradition, from what I understand, was to have a clear marking of those boundaries, because that had implications for what the church was responsible for in that society. There were certain things that, such as caring for unwed children, that fell on their shoulders, and somehow where the boundaries were dictated whatever the responsibilities were. So taking photos, but rolling video of beating the bounds could be fun. Of course, Christmas Day, New Year's Day, those things are pretty obvious. Twelfth Night, I was a little less familiar with. I always think of the Shakespearean play. But apparently the King's Cake, and I think of New Orleans, I think of Mardi Gras, and there are close ties to the liturgical calendar and what happens here in the United States, down in New Orleans as well. But the King Cake came out of that Twelfth Night celebration. Apparently it was cooked on the Twelfth Night. There was also wassailing, the singing of Christmas carols that took place until the 1950s, at least, in the UK. And that probably had to do because of the advent of television. People were now stuck in their living rooms looking at the tube and not going out and connecting with the community. There was also Candlemas, and this one I'd never heard of before. So I found a wonderful video that introduced me to a whole new series regarding Tudor life, and it's put on by an author, Claire Ridgway. And the series on YouTube, which I'll link to in the comment section below, is the Anne Boleyn Files and Tudor Society. And what she's doing is every single day, from what I understand or what I saw briefly, is she gives an update on what happened during that particular day in Tudor history. So this is one of the series that I plan to really watch. Part of my goal in doing this is, again, I'm not speaking from the standpoint of a voice of an expert. I'm just a guy who's exploring history later in life and trying to figure out all the stuff that I have forgotten and possibly missed. But one of the joys is to tap into and make connections to some of those channels on YouTube, for example, or Twitter, that are experts in this topic area. Let's see, the next one was Shrovetide, which had a connection to the carnival. So I think of New Orleans and Mardi Gras, culminating in a day of confession, Shrove Tuesday. I guess that preceded Lent. So all of these were occasions of celebration that just would have been visually spectacular. Great to capture photos, wonderful to roll video. I'd want to have professional audio as well, just to get all of that. And wouldn't it be amazing to open up some time capsule and find that there was this wealth of visual material that was formatted in such a way that our technology could read it? And there we're getting into fantasy land again. Some of the other activities that may have taken place during these festivals would have been arranged by the Office of Revels. Riddles, I don't know exactly what that is. Backgammon, the game, Shakespearean plays, athletic contest, and joust. There were folk plays called mummings. So those are kind of cool, but not as cool as the mask, which have come over from Italy. Let me read this little section beginning on page 13, where Durant describes what that mask would have been like. He's described it as a gaudy mixture of pageantry, poetry, music, allegory, buffoonery, and ballet. And Queen Elizabeth did pirouettes until she was 69. Ballet put together by playwrights and artists, presented at court or on rich estates with complex machinery and evolutions, and performed by masked ladies and gentlemen, burdened with costly costumes and simple lines. Just sounds like a visual feast that would be really fun to capture. The final thing that I'll mention here is that Queen Elizabeth also left the 5 palaces and went on horseback often throughout the country just to tour the lands, to meet the people, to see what the domain was like. And wouldn't it be fun to put a GoPro, I don't know, somewhere on a crown, to get Queen Cam or Crown Cam? And could you imagine the footage, though, of watching? You know, the best we have today is to imagine, based on movies that we see, what that scene would have been like. But to have the actual footage would be just fantastic. Anyway, these festivals, Ascension Day, Twelfth Night, Candlemas, and Shrovetide, these are now on my radar. I'm curious about these. And so what I would like to do is keep my eye open for groups, perhaps in the Anglican community here in the United States, who might meet together and celebrate in some ways that might give me a sense of what these celebrations could have been like even back in Elizabethan time. So if I happen to find my way to those groups, I might take my cameras with me and do a special episode of those events. So next time we will be in section 5, and it will look at Elizabeth and religion. And that's kind of interesting because Durant's book is entitled The Age of Reason Begins, and yet we're kind of still dealing with a whole bunch of religious stuff here. And externally, Elizabeth fully participated in all these things, but we'll see if that was really the case inside her own head. We'll see you back next time. Thanks.